32. I asked my Amish husband to eat without me once. His mother arrived before supper. The chair at the head of our supper table had a particular sound when it was pulled back. A low scrape against the wooden floor, deliberate and unhurried, the kind of sound that announced authority without needing a single word to follow it. I heard that sound for the first time on the evening of my wedding day, when my mother-in-law, Miriam, sat down before I had finished carrying the food from the stove. I was 22 years old. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself she was simply tired from the celebration. I had spent most of my life telling myself that small things meant nothing, and I was very good at it by then. My name is Sarah. I grew up in a community in eastern Ohio, the second of 6 children, raised in a household where my father's word closed every conversation, and my mother's silence was the most fluent language in the house. I was not unhappy as a girl. I want to say that clearly, because what I am about to tell you is not a story about a miserable childhood. It is a story about a woman who believed she understood the rules of her world, and who discovered, one ordinary evening when she asked for something small, that the rules had never been written for her protection. I married Elam Brenneman in the spring of my 22nd year. He was 27, steady and quiet, a man who fixed things with his hands and rarely raised his voice. My mother said those were the 2 qualities that mattered most. My father said Elam came from a good family, and in our district, that phrase carried the full weight of a recommendation. I did not know, on the day I married him, that coming from a good family meant coming with Miriam attached. The way a deed comes with the land it describes. Inseparable, non-negotiable, already written before you arrive to sign anything. Miriam Brenneman was not a cruel woman in the way that word is usually understood. She never shouted. She never struck anyone in my presence. She was organized and capable and genuinely devoted to the idea of a well-ordered home. What she possessed, in the place where warmth might otherwise have lived, was an absolute certainty that she knew the correct way to do everything: cook a meal, raise a son, receive a new daughter-in-law, and that any deviation from her method was not simply different, but wrong, in a way that required correction. She communicated this certainty through small, precise gestures. A plate repositioned 1 inch to the left. A pot lifted off the flame 30 seconds before the new wife would have lifted it. A comment about bread that ended with the words, "Alam has always preferred it this way." In the beginning, I watched these corrections carefully and said nothing. This was not weakness. In our community, a new wife spent the first year learning the household she had married into, and deference was not considered a failure of character. It was considered wisdom. I believed that. I genuinely believed that if I paid close enough attention, learned quickly enough, pleased consistently enough, the corrections would slow and eventually stop. I believed Miriam's attention was a temporary condition, the natural concern of a mother handing over a son, and that it would ease once she trusted me. Miriam lived 3 miles from our farmhouse, close enough to arrive without notice, and far enough that her presence required intention. She came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, reliably, in the early afternoon, and she always stayed through supper. Elam treated these visits as fixed as the calendar, as natural as sunrise. When I asked him, gently, in our 4th month of marriage, whether we might sometimes have our evenings to ourselves, he looked at me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not anger exactly, but something quieter and more concerning. A careful patience, as though I had said something he had expected, and had already prepared a response for. "She is my mother, Sarah," he said. "This is how our family is." I accepted that. I folded it into my understanding of my new life, and continued. What I did not know in those early months was that Miriam and Elam spoke to each other far more often than I witnessed. I knew they talked during her visits. I knew Elam sometimes walked to her house on Sunday afternoons, and returned in time for evening prayer. What I did not know was that they also exchanged letters, short, practical notes passed through Elam's younger brother, Jonas, who came to our farm twice a week to help with the heavier fieldwork. I discovered this by accident in our 7th month of marriage, when I found a folded piece of paper on the floor near the barn door, written in Miriam's tight, even handwriting. It contained only 4 lines, but one of them included my name, and the sentence around my name used the word correction. I replaced the letter exactly where I had found it. I finished hanging the laundry. I did not mention it to Elam that evening, or any evening after that. But something shifted in me on that afternoon. A small, quiet repositioning, like a stone settling deeper into cold ground. I began paying attention differently, not to Miriam's cooking instructions, or her furniture adjustments, but to the timing of things. When she arrived, what Elam said before she came, what was different in his manner on the days Jonas had been to the farm. My closest friend in those years was a woman named Ruth, who had married into a farm 2 miles east of ours. Ruth had grown up in a different district, and carried with her a slightly different way of seeing things, less concerned with appearances than most of the women I knew, more willing to name what she observed. I confided in Ruth about the letter, and she was quiet for a long time before she said anything. "Does Elam tell you things before they happen?" she asked. "Or do you usually find out after?" I thought about it honestly. "After," I said. Ruth nodded slowly, and said nothing more on the subject, but the question stayed with me like a splinter too deep to reach. The evening everything clarified came in the second autumn of our marriage. I had been unwell for 3 days. Nothing serious, a heavy cold that had settled in my chest and made standing over the stove for long periods genuinely difficult. On the third afternoon, I found Elam in the yard before supper, and asked him something I had never asked before. I asked him to eat without me that evening. I explained that I needed to lie down, that I would leave food warming on the stove, that I simply needed one night where I was not expected at the table. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded once and said it was fine. I went upstairs. I did not fall immediately asleep. I lay on top of the quilt in my dress, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me, and I felt something I had almost forgotten how to feel, a quiet, uncrowded hour that belonged only to my own body's need. I was grateful for it. I thought, in that slow, half-conscious way of a person beginning to rest, that perhaps things were simpler than I had been making them. That perhaps Elam was a reasonable man, and I had only needed to ask. I heard the wagon before I heard the door. The wheels came up the lane, at exactly the pace Miriam's horse always set, measured, unhurried, purposeful. I lay still for a moment, certain I was misreading the sound, certain it was a neighbor or Jonas returning for a forgotten tool. Then I heard the particular scrape of our front room door, which caught slightly on the left side and required a specific lifting motion to open quietly. Miriam knew that motion. She had shown it to me herself on my third day in the house. I did not go downstairs immediately. I lay there and listened to the sounds of another woman moving through my kitchen. The stove lid lifted, a pot repositioned, the low murmur of her voice, and Elam's voice folding together in a conversation I could not make out from above. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, and I felt something I could not name at the time, but can name clearly now. It was the feeling of a door I had thought was open, revealing itself to have a lock I had never been given a key for. I came downstairs eventually. I told myself I would simply appear, thank Miriam for coming, explain that I was feeling better, and would eat a little at the table. What I found when I descended was a fully served supper, my chair pushed slightly to the side to accommodate Miriam's customary place, and Elam seated comfortably across from his mother, as though the arrangement was entirely natural. Miriam looked up at me with an expression of measured concern. "Elam mentioned you were unwell," she said. "I thought it best to come." Elam did not meet my eyes. I sat down. I ate. I said the things a grateful daughter-in-law was expected to say, but my hands, beneath the table, were folded tightly in my lap, and I was doing something I had not done in a long time. I was counting. I was counting every Tuesday, every Thursday, every Sunday afternoon walk, every folded note passed through Jonas's hands, every meal where Miriam had repositioned something of mine, and Elam had not noticed, or had not chosen to notice. I was counting them all, and they were adding up to something I did not want to see clearly, but could no longer avoid. After supper, while I washed the dishes, I heard Elam and Miriam in the front room. I could not hear the words, but I heard the tone, easy, familiar, relaxed in a way that Elam's voice almost never was with me. I heard Miriam laugh once, softly. I set the last dish on the rack, and stood at the window for a moment, watching the dark shape of the barn against the evening sky, and I understood something about my marriage that I had been circling for nearly 2 years without landing on it directly. Elam was not a man who had grown into independence and then chosen his mother's guidance as a supplement. He was a man who had never left the structure of her household. Not truly, not in the ways that mattered. Our marriage had not created a new household. It had added a room to hers. I went to Ruth the following week. I told her about the evening, the wagon, the rearranged chair, Elam's averted eyes. Ruth listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked me whether I had spoken to Elam directly about what had happened. I told her I had tried that morning, carefully, using the mildest words I could find. I told her he had listened, and then said that his mother had only been trying to help, and that perhaps I was reading too much into a simple act of care. "What did Jonas say to you on Tuesday?" Ruth asked. I frowned. "Nothing unusual. He brought back the harrow he had borrowed. Did he come inside?" I thought back. Jonas had come into the kitchen for a glass of water, as he sometimes did. He had stood near the table while I poured it. He had asked, without particular emphasis, how I was feeling. I set down the mug I was holding. Ruth watched me make the connection. She did not say anything to help me along. She simply waited while I understood that Jonas had reported to Miriam that I was unwell, that Miriam had told Elam she would come, that Elam had agreed, and that his agreement to let me eat alone that evening had never been a moment of private generosity between a husband and a wife. It had been a managed situation. He had already known his mother was coming when he nodded and said it was fine. What followed that understanding was not a dramatic confrontation. I want to be honest about that, because I know it is what people expect, and I think the expectation itself reveals something true about the distance between how we imagine we would respond to these discoveries and how we actually do. I did not go home and demand answers. I went home and made supper, and moved through the next several weeks with a careful, watchful stillness. The way you move when you are in a place that is no longer safe but you have not yet found the door. I did speak to Elam again. About 3 weeks later, more directly than I had before. I told him that I needed to understand the arrangement between him and his mother, not to end it, but to understand it, to know where the boundaries of our marriage actually sat. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I have never forgotten, spoken in his same measured, undisturbed tone. "My mother raised me right," he said. "I don't see why that should change now." I asked him if he had known she was coming the evening I asked him to eat without me. He was quiet again. Then he said, "She was concerned about you." He did not answer my question. He would not answer it directly for another 4 months, and when he finally did, it was not because I had pressed him skillfully or worn him down with patience. It was because Ruth's husband, against Ruth's knowledge, and certainly against my own wishes, mentioned to the bishop that I had been asking questions about household authority and a wife's right to private arrangements. The bishop came to our farm on a Thursday morning, 2 hours before Miriam's customary arrival, and the three of them, Elam, Miriam, and the bishop, sat in our front room, while I stood in the kitchen doorway and was told, in language both patient and absolute, that a wife's discomfort with her husband's family arrangements was a matter of spiritual correction, not personal negotiation. I looked at Elam while the bishop spoke. He was looking at the floor. His hands were folded in his lap, and he looked less like a husband whose authority was being defended, and more like a son who had asked for help managing something he found difficult. I understood, in that moment, everything I needed to understand. I stayed for 14 more months. I want to be clear that the reasons were not simple cowardice, because I have spent enough years examining them to know they were more complicated than that. I stayed because leaving required arrangements that a woman in my position could not make quickly or invisibly. I stayed because Ruth was the only person I fully trusted, and she was afraid for her own household if she helped me too visibly. I stayed because I had a genuine, if diminishing, hope that something might shift, that Elam might one day look up from the floor and choose differently. He did not. I left on a Wednesday morning in late autumn, when Elam was in the far field and Jonas had not yet arrived. I took what belonged to me, my mother's Bible, a small amount of money I had saved carefully over 18 months from household accounts, and a letter I had written and sealed 3 days earlier. addressed to Elam, that said everything I had been unable to say aloud in 3 years of marriage. I left the letter on the kitchen table, in the center, where he would see it before he looked for anything else. I walked to Ruth's house. Ruth had known I was coming, in the way a true friend knows things, without being told every detail. She had already spoken to her cousin in the next county, a woman who had left a similar situation years earlier, and rebuilt a life carefully and without drama. Ruth held my hands when I arrived, and did not say anything for a long moment. Then she made tea, and we sat together, while the morning moved past the windows. I heard later, through a cousin of my own who remained in the community, that Miriam had arrived at the farmhouse that Thursday, 2 days after I left, and had found Elam sitting at the kitchen table with my letter still unfolded in front of him. She had, according to my cousin, immediately begun reorganizing the kitchen. She had moved back into the farmhouse within the week. I have thought about that image many times over the years. Not with bitterness, or not only with bitterness. Miriam was a woman who had shaped her entire life around the management of one household and one son, and I think what I represented to her was never truly a threat to her authority, but rather an untidy variable in a system she had spent decades perfecting. I do not think she was capable of understanding what she had done, because doing so would have required her to see me as a person, with an interior life as real as her own, and that was a vision her world had never required her to develop. Elam I understand less clearly, even now. He was not a violent man. He was not, I believe, deliberately cruel. He was a man who had been raised inside a particular arrangement of loyalty, and had never once been required to examine it. When I asked to eat alone that one evening, the request was so small, so laughably, heartbreakingly small, that its meaning was not in the request itself. Its meaning was in the response. The fact that he had said yes while already having called his mother told me something about the nature of his yes that I should have perhaps understood much earlier. When Elam agreed to something, he first checked whether someone else agreed, and that someone, in every matter that touched the running of his home, was never me. I am 51 years old as I tell you this. I live in a small house 2 states away from the community where I was raised, and I work in a fabric shop where I am allowed to be as particular about the arrangement of things as I genuinely wish to be. I remarried once, briefly, and that is a different story for a different time. I am not unhappy. I want to be clear about that too. What I carry from those years is not primarily the large things, the bishop's visit, the letter on the table, the morning I walked away. What I carry is the sound of that chair, that slow, deliberate scrape against the wooden floor, announcing arrival without asking permission, settling into the room as though the room had always been waiting for exactly that wait. I hear it sometimes in quiet moments, and I let myself hear it now without flinching, because I have learned that the sounds that once frightened us can eventually become simply sounds. I asked my husband to eat without me once. He said yes, and his mother arrived before supper. I spent a long time believing that evening was the beginning of my understanding. I know now it was simply the evening I stopped pretending I did not already know.